All right. Um, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope you have had a good week and you will have a better weekend. Welcome to what is the first of a webinar series that we are calling the Deconstructed Webinar Series presented by the Ashoka Behavioral Insights team. The name of the first webinar series, as you can see on your screens, is Navigating Behavioral Science. We've called the series overall Deconstructed because as we are exploring this field through our club and spreading it in the wider Ashokan context and campus, we know that this field is both complex and ever changing, and we believe that breaking it down to its simplest and most understandable parts is the best way to explain it. Therefore, who better to introduce it than people who have recently joined this field and are working right at the beating heart of it? And it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for today, Ayush Agarwal and Tirtha Patil. Both work at the CSBC. Ayush is a excuse me. Yes, Ayush is a research associate who specializes within the field of empirical behavioral science testing, specifically in the field of public policy. He holds a degree in public policy from Flame University with a minor in international relations, whereas Tirtha is a manager at the CSBC who also is specifically interested within the empirical aspect, and I'm sure they'll be able to present this better than I am, of behavioral science, and has a degree both in applied mathematics and environmental studies. So just a couple of ground rules as mentioned in the chat box, and I will be directing it here as well. Please, when the speakers are speaking, do not interrupt them so that the conversation flows on well and they're able to present it clearly. And if you do have any questions during that specific time, please direct it to either me, the Ashoka Students Behavioral Insight team, or Trisha Nagpal, and we will be asking the questions once we open up to open Q&A. And without further ado, we request our speakers to thank you.
Great. Thanks, Udyon. Thanks for having us. Hi, everyone. Good evening. And let me dive right into the presentation we have here. So overall, what we'll be discussing with you is what behavioral science is. We've been briefed that not a lot of undergrads currently are very familiar with this field. I mean, it has been heard of, but what exactly goes on within it is sort of cryptic, and it's not exactly very transparent to somebody who is interested on the first occasion. So we want to break down what behavior science is and why it's relevant nowadays, why so many countries around the world, so many governments, they're setting up these behavior insights unit to guide their policy making. So why that is, we'll go into a bit about that. And then we'll also talk a bit about how CSBC, which is the center where we work, Center for Social and Behavior Change, how we apply behavior science here at work, how we help advise in Niti Aayog and other organizations that we work with regarding applied behavior science, and the various constituents of our uh, organization and how we go about our work. We'll also be talking about a few of the research projects we're doing, so you get an idea of the kind of domains we're working in, the kind of nudges we're creating, and the kind of policy we're trying to guide. Finally, we'd like to end with our personal experience. And here we'll be talking a bit about how, as recent graduates who graduated between the last 1 to 3 years, how we've entered the field of experimental social sciences and specifically behavior science. And how that transition occurred from college to working here, and what motivated us and what interests us, stuff like that. Cool. Starting with what behavior science is and why it's relevant. So behavior science isn't exactly a pure field. It's a very interdisciplinary field. It's a science created with the amalgamation of marketing and advertising, which is where the primary private interests into behavior science come in. We all saw that recent Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. That has a lot to do with the marketing and advertising side of behavior science. Then we have social and cognitive psychology, which gives us all the guiding principles we have in understanding human behavior, and we apply that in marketing and advertising and in the public sector as well. So that's where most of the behavior principles, human biases, and the workings of the human brain that we know, the principles come from there. And finally, we have behavioral economics, which is where we test and understand and sort of derive measurable effects of behavior science and behaviorally backed interventions on whatever research we're doing, on our hypotheses, whatever we're interested in applying behavior science to. So it's an amalgamation of these three fields. And a few key points to note about behavior science are, first, behavior is intent plus action. And all of us have this intent to action gap, which behavior science as a field tries to sort of bridge. Intent may be present, but it does not have to, and it does not always translate into action. So that last mile connectivity is a lot of what we do. Then the science part of behavior science comes in from the experimental inclination of it, how we use behavior econ principles, we use gamification, we use experimental methods to test our ideas of behavior science and test whether they're viable on the field, whether they work on field. So that's about the field. Now, I'll just go into what underlies, what is the primary law. It's a seminal work on behavioral economics by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, famously coined System 1 and System 2. And System 1 and System 2 is what a lot of behavior science is based upon. For those of you who don't know, all humans behave based on either System 1 or System 2. So these systems are what drive our human behavior. System 1 is where 90% of our decision making takes place. It's the fast system, it's the intuitive one, it's the instinctive one, and it's unconscious, which basically means it kicks in first and you make most of your instinctual decision based on System 1. System 2 is the more rational, more calculative, more slow process of decision making, where we take a step back, we analyze what the problem is, and then we consciously come up with solutions. This is a very small contributor to actual human decision making, because a lot of human decisions just go with System 1. We make quick decisions that may or may not be rational all the time. And this is what Taylor famously pointed out, that we are very, very irrational people, and rational econ principles don't really apply to us because of all these human biases that are plaguing our System 1. And System 1 is where we leverage behavior science to reduce or sort of guide those biases towards the correct direction. I'm sure a lot of this will make sense as we go into the actual experiments we're doing. But before that, I'd just like to do this activity. Trisha or Udayan, if one of you could just help me out over here and unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for volunteering, Trisha. So my request to you is, I'll be on the next slide, I'll be showing you some words, and I want you to read the words aloud as fast as you can. So as soon as you see a word, just read it out, all right? All right, here goes.
Blue, orange, red, green, black, yellow, blue.
Perfect. Quite fast. As soon as you read it, you were able to say the word. Very System 1 behavior. But now I want you to say the color in which the words are written as fast as you can. So again, as soon as you see a word, say the color it's written in instead of the word. All right, here goes.
black, red, green, purple, blue, black, pink. Yeah, the first
Correct.
one was easier.
Yeah, exactly. So the point that I want to make here is that the amount of time that it takes for system 2 in the second activity to sort of understand and analyze what's going on, it's more than what system 1 took in the first activity. And that is where a lot of good decision making goes to die, because system 1 kicks into play very fast and we're not able to properly analyze what we're doing, and we don't want to slow down either. So like is illustrated in this slide, system 1 is very powerful and it makes very fast decisions, and system 2 is the slow one, which takes a lot of time to process. Cool. Another example for you, and this one's for all of you. A bat and a ball cost $1.05 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
$1.
Okay, you knew that. Sorry, what did you say?
No, half, like 0.5, the 5 cents, 0.5, 0.05.
Right. Could you also explain the reasoning behind that?
I mean, I can tell you how I initially got it wrong, which is that it says the bat costs $1 more than the ball, so you assume it costs $1 together. Sorry, 0.1, because I'm confusing the numbers a bit, but you'd assume that it costs $1. You'll assume that it costs 1.1 cents. Yeah, that's a good response.
All right, yeah. So system 1 says that, okay, the bat costs $1 more than the ball. That means that the ball must cost, sorry, hold on. Tirtha,
Nothing. It costs nothing. No, wait, I messed up. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Yeah.
So the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? There's an error in the question. The question is actually $1.10 in total. So the ball costs 5 cents and the bat costs $1.05. Slightly messed up the wording there, but I think you got the point. Cool. So in summary, this is what behavior science is. We think much less than we think we think. We find thinking using system 2 tiring and hence rely heavily on system 1, which is a lot of emotional and instinctive reactions. And system 1 is plagued with human biases, all sorts of hyperbolic discounting, present bias, all sorts of biases creep in where the mind is quick and irrational. And so that's where behavior science comes in and tries to reduce human biases and guide humans towards more rational behavior by leveraging their biases. And here I'll pause and hand it over to Tirtha to discuss how we apply behavior science at CSBC.
Thank you so much, Ayush, for that great introduction for behavior science. I think that covers the wider gambit of what Ayush mentioned and where it can be used and what other fields does it take inspiration from, right? Overall, what I would like to say is when it comes to behavioral economics, what you see is how is it different from your neoclassical theory of economics, wherein your base assumption for any of the laws that you derive is that all humans act rationally, right? But that assumption itself is wrong. And the minute we realized that and incorporated that bit into creating new laws and identifying what these different rationality itself means and that humans don't behave rationally all the time, that was the point from which we started developing economic theory without that assumption. And that's where I would say behavioral economics started, right? Briefly, what I would also like to discuss over the presentation is the work that Center for Social and Behavior Change does. As you all might know already, the center is it's hosted by Ashoka University, but it's primarily currently funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our work is divided primarily in 4 different components, 3 of which are action, capacity building, and research. If you could move on to the next slide, Ayush. Perfect. So starting with the action work that we do. So this is directly what the kind of work that we do as part of behavioral economics into public policy, and how we contribute to decision making and policy implementation decisions. The idea over here is that this is the kind of work that we do with the government directly. So for example, we are currently in the process of starting multiple behavioral insights units across India. The first one that we set up is with Niti Aayog along with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The work that we are doing currently is more proof of concept. So the idea is that we picked up 5 main human development, health and nutrition indicators. And what we are trying to do is improve those indicators in districts which are performing extremely poorly on those indicators, right? So for example, I don't know if everybody has heard about it, but Niti Aayog has this program called Aspirational Districts Program, which basically lists out and keeps track of 117 districts across India, which are extremely poor performing on human development indicators. And this is across a wide range, right? It's across health and nutrition, financial inclusion, education, infrastructure, and so on. The idea is that they have given us a fixed set of indicators. That's 5 health and nutrition indicators, and we have to work through improving them in those specific districts. So that is more of the action work that we do. Apart from working with government, we also work with other external private stakeholders. Like we're working on a project with American Cancer Society and the Cancer Foundation of India on increasing the uptake of HPV vaccination amongst adolescent girls in India. We are working with Umedyar Network on increasing people's perception of privacy, and also increasing people's behavior, that is their behavior of making more privacy conscious decisions when they're using digital apps, etc. Right? So that is the kind of work we do. Now, what differentiates the action work from the other 3 work is that for the action work, a very specific problem is given to us, right? Like for instance, if you see the indicators that Niti has provided us, one of the indicators tells you that it's how do you increase the uptake of iron and folic acid tablets amongst pregnant women in India. So it's a very specific problem. What you have to now do is analyze this problem, break it down into smaller components as to what are the different barriers to this behavior. Why is it that pregnant women aren't already consuming iron and folic acid tablets? And then accordingly design interventions and test them in order to implement evidence-based policy. So it's that specific problem. When we move on to the research work that CSBC does, that work is primarily twofold. So one is supporting the action work, right? So as I would talk in the next slide, it's the action project goes through 5 steps. One is doing qualitative work to understand these different barriers, actually going down to the field to see whether there is proper supply of IFA tablets. Even if they are provided for free, why is it that people are not taking it? Also talking to pregnant women to see what are the different issues they face when they take folic acid tablets, and so on. So it's that qualitative work that we help the action team with. After doing that qualitative work, we help them with designing the intervention itself and then testing it experimentally. So when I say testing it experimentally, what I mean is I have a designed intervention. It's a proper collateral. Let's say it's a job aid for the frontline health worker to use when they're talking to the pregnant women. And the idea over here is to see whether that concept of using that specific intervention is actually leading to an increase in the uptake of iron and folic acid tablets amongst the pregnant women in comparison to the control group, for which the ANMs and the ASHA workers would not have used the job aid, right? So it's measuring the internal validity of the intervention and seeing how effective it is. And post that, then also helping them with a pilot phase, which is primarily seeing the external validity of these interventions. When it's clubbed with the other programs that take place in the health and nutrition environment, does it still make sense? How is it different between districts? What are the differences, cultural differences, language differences that need to be taken into account in order for the intervention to be as effective in all the places across India, right? So that is the one layer of work that the research team helps the action team with. The other work that the research team also does at CSBC is doing foundational research for the purpose of publishing white papers or peer-reviewed journal articles, and at the same time working with external research organizations. Like, for instance, we recently collaborated with the Center for Decision Research, which is part of the Booth School of Business under University of Chicago, and so on. Right, so it's doing that seminal work. It's creating a body of foundational behavioral research in India, given that majority of the behavioral research done so far has been on the weird population, the Western population. Moving on to the third vertical, which is capacity building. Here, the idea is primarily to develop behavioral science and behavioral economics capacity within the government as academics and as students. So the idea is even part of the behavioral insights unit that we are doing with NEETI. These 5 projects that I currently talked about are primarily proof of concept. So we work alongside the NEETI team so that they can pick up these skills and eventually have their own capacity to do the work that we are doing currently. Right, so it's developing that capacity. It's helping them out with understanding behavioral science and the entire methodology that goes behind it. And lastly, it's visibility. So it's sharing the insights that we generate through research and through action work with other people and make it available to the public so that everybody can use it. Moving on to the next slide. So this is the 5-step process that I was referring to when I was discussing the action vertical work. Each of the action project goes through these 5-step process, which is basically you define a problem, right? For example, in the NEETI work, we have a specific problem of IFA, iron and folic acid tablet consumption. But when I say define, it's what district are you going to focus on? Why only IFA tablet consumption? What about other iron and folic acid fortified foods, right? Like, identifying what area even within iron and folic acid supplementation do we want to focus on. So it's that level of definition, followed by diagnosis, which is primarily qualitative work, field work, identifying what are the different barriers and facilitators to the problem behavior. Design is primarily a phase wherein we ideate on different interventions based in behavioral literature. So it could be either communication interventions, it could be nudges, and so on, right? It could be multiple different ways of coming up with tackling these barriers and leveraging the facilitators that we found on ground. Followed by that, we enter into a prototyping stage where we come up with physical collaterals for these interventions. And these are again taken back to the field and checked with the population to see how they respond to this. On the feedback that we receive, we update these interventions, and then they go into the test phase where you measure internal validity through either lab or lab in the field experiments. That is, while controlling every other variable that you have, and primarily focusing on the relationship between the intervention and the output. Post that, we enter the scale phase, as I said, which is for external validity, for seeing how the intervention performs in other districts apart from the 2, where you conducted your diagnosis as well as the test phase. Right? Moving on to the next slide. Perfect. I guess now what we are going to do is, overall, we have spoken about the process in depth of the action projects. Now we're going to also talk about a couple of research, foundational research projects that we've done, or projects, research work that we've done as rapid response work. So for instance, we did a lot of COVID work with the government for the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, as well as Women and Child Development, as well as a lot of state governments like the Bihar state government, Gujarat state government, and so on, and help them develop communication materials for increasing the uptake of COVID protective behaviors like mask wearing, social distancing, and so on during the pandemic, before the lockdown, as well as during and after the lockdown, right? So the research that I'll talk about now is the research that we did on mask wearing right when the lockdown was about to end for the Bihar state government. Perfect. So we ran 2 pilots with the Bihar population, and this was right in middle of, like, during the pandemic. So it wasn't like we were able to go to the field and conduct research. All this research happened purely remotely. So it was through WhatsApp and through phone surveys that we conducted this research, right? The idea was that we worked very closely with the behavioral change communication core team of Bihar, which included, of course, BMGF, Project Concern International, McCann, and other development partners. And then we conducted this research, whereas McCann and BMGF helped us produce the audio clips that we tested out during this evaluation. Moving on to the next slide. So we broke down this entire research into 2 pilots. The first pilot answered the question of how effective are the communication, are the audio clips that they had created. At that point in time, the 4 audio clips that they had created were divided between fear-based messaging versus pro-social messaging, right? That is basically, when I say fear-based messaging, it's tapping into the emotions of their loved ones and saying that they are unsafe, and hence directing them towards call to action, right? So it's leveraging the fear of the illness itself and the sense of social obligation that you have towards your family of protecting your family, right? The second kind of audio clips were more the pro-social route that instigated the individual to turn into corona warriors, right? For the safety of their loved ones. So if you don't wear a mask, you're not putting yourself in harm's way, but rather your loved ones, right? So that was the kind of messaging that we used in the second set of audio clips. So if you see over here, the 2 audio clips, one was fear of the family's health. So it was actually a granddaughter telling her grandfather, who used to go out on walks during lockdown, as to, do you not care that I will be alone if you actually fall sick, right? And if something happens to you, given that you're a vulnerable population for the disease of COVID. And the second audio clip over there was about family health, wherein a woman is telling her husband, who just walked into the house and is washing all the vegetables that he got, and telling him, why do you need to do that? And he expresses how scared he is for his family, and the fear that he feels that he lose them if something happens, if either of them get COVID, right? And similarly, in the pro-social route, we had the similar kinds of messaging as to, stay within your house, do not make non-essential trips, wear a mask when you step out, maintain social, etc. Given by the army man, and the other, the same thing, was given by a frontline health worker. So over here, we are trying to see the messenger effect as to which is a good messenger. What do people respond to more? Right. Moving on to the next slide. Right. In the second pilot, what we measured was which is the better pathway for increasing risk perception, right? Like, how scared would I be? What is my risk perception of stepping out during the lockdown, of not only putting myself in harm's way, but also other people. And increasing your protective behaviors, right? So the 2 routes that we took over here were devaluing myths. One about temperature and weather, wherein, people had this phase wherein they believe that once summers land, COVID will eventually disappear because it's just flu, right? Like, nothing's going to happen to you after summer. And it's these myths that they were busting, and a couple of other misconceptions surrounding COVID. Similarly, the other route that we took was knowledge of symptoms, right? Like, whether me discussing what is wrong helps in increasing risk perception, or whether me telling you what will happen to you if you get COVID increases risk perception. So over there, we talked about dry cough and fear, wherein it's very difficult to identify whether you have COVID just from the way you cough or fever, because they are flu symptoms. So you would just brush it off saying it's flu, but it's not actually flu, right? So the idea over here is one of the protective behaviors is getting yourself tested or reporting that you have COVID, because in between people were very scared of reporting that they have COVID, even though they showed flu-like symptoms. And the last bit is the interesting question that we later on added to this, and we created a clip, which was, does speed bumping help in the process of information more clearly and influencing these protective behaviors? Now, what I mean by speed bumping here is, again, speed bumping is a nudge. So cool down period, as based on what Ayush explained earlier of system 1 and system 2 thinking, what speed bumping does is it basically provides that 10 to 20 second pause to activate your systems 2 thinking, right? Given that it takes a little bit of time. So it gives you a subtle signal that the decision that you are making without that pause can actually lead to undesirable outcomes, right? And this enhances system 2 thinking, and hence people will actually take the COVID messaging more seriously. So we tested out that treatment as well. Moving on to the next slide. The couple of outcome variables that we measured, right? Now, when I say we tested, what I mean is whenever you want to test something, you need a control group and a treatment group, right? Treatment group is the one that receives these interventions. Control group is the one that does not receive these interventions. And after this has been sent out, what you do is you measure a couple of things to see whether the risk perception has increased, whether the intention to practice these behaviors have increased, whether the behavior itself has increased, right? So the couple of outcome variables that we measured through the survey were comprehension, that is whether they understood the treatment or not, whether they are aware about the current risk levels of COVID, whether they intend to practice this behavior, right? Like intention of going out, making non-essential visits, intention of wearing a mask when they step out, intention of reporting symptoms to health workers, and so on. And finally, we also tested a couple of actual behaviors, that is the practice of these behaviors, which is, instead of asking, do you intend to step out, you also ask, what are the number of essential as well as non-essential visits that you made in the past 2 days, right? And so on. So post that, we also asked a couple of demographic questions to also build a profile of the subjects that we were using, and so on. Moving on to the next slide. The way we implemented this is actually very interesting. In times of COVID, what we did is, given that we had access to the Bihar government and they supported this evaluation, they, through Project Concern International, put us in touch with the health and nutrition officers in each of these districts in Bihar, who actually belong to the Jivika infrastructure. Jivika infrastructure in Bihar is basically the health and nutrition department infrastructure in Bihar that takes care of all the different health indicators in that state. Under them comes the community mobilizers, who were then acting as our subject pool. So what we basically did is we selected 10 community mobilizers randomly under each health and nutrition officer. And it was through the health and nutrition officer that we got their phone numbers and WhatsApp numbers. Prior to giving the treatment, the HNOs recruited these CMs. We randomized them into different treatment groups and created WhatsApp groups of each of these treatments. So let's say message 1 is one WhatsApp group, audio 2 is the second WhatsApp group, and so on. Post that, we sent out audios on these WhatsApp groups and requested them to watch it and share it with others if necessary. And after a space of 24 hours, we requested the HNOs to conduct the survey, which asked questions about the outcome variables and measures that I depicted before. So that was the entire process that we conducted this research in. And from that, the thing that we found is that fear-based messaging at that point during the lockdown was more effective than pro-sociality based messaging, right? So I would rather be told that I am scared for my family than be told that I should be wearing a mask to save other people. Similarly, according to for the devaluing myths and increasing the knowledge of symptoms, as we know that there were wide misconceptions prevalent during this time, we saw that devaluing myths treatment audio clips worked out better and resulted in more effective results than the knowledge of symptoms treatment. And the last, the speed bumping one, given the smaller sample size, we could not particularly capture any evidence for it. So there wasn't much difference between the control group and the speed bumping treatment group. Overall, what we found is the messengers that were directly associated with a pandemic, that is the frontline health workers who actually went door to door to distribute medicines, to ask questions about symptoms, etc., were more effective about COVID messaging rather than a random army man who even though generates patriotic emotions with regard to protecting and being corona warriors, the frontline health workers were more relatable. And lastly, what was very interesting to see is that the Bihar government actually implemented and used these evaluations in their dissemination, right? So these results, they directly informed the Bihar State Health Department's decision of which messages to disseminate across the state and for COVID response, and help them mobilize the limited resources that they already had at that point behind the most effective response strategies rather than spreading their resources thin over sending out all those audio clips. And so on. I think I'm going to now let Ayush talk about this other very interesting project on stigmatization during COVID that we did.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Tirtha. So I'll be talking about this other project that we're currently working on. It's called stigmatization. This project deals with we essentially want to test whether the act of making counter-attitudinal arguments. So if a certain person makes a debate that is counter to their actual attitudes, does that effectively reduce their negative perception about the group they're supporting through their debate? So what we wanted to test was if we make a stigma holding person defend somebody who they stigmatized, would that actually reduce the stigma that is perceived by the stigmatizing person? So the principle, the psychological principle underlying this, what brought this study about, is Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory. According to this theory essentially states that by expressing counter-attitudinal views, especially under conditions where there's an audience present, there is dissonance that is induced, which is essentially the difference between an individual's attitudes and their performed behaviors. So in this particular experiment, the attitude is stigma and the behavior is defending the person stigmatized. These are very counter-attitudinal, they're opposing attitudes and behaviors. And what the theory suggests is that when such difference or dissonance exists in a person, the person is motivated to reduce that dissonance. And the way that they reduce it is by changing their beliefs or by trying to change other people's beliefs in a way that supports what they did. So in this case, in theory, if somebody argued in favor of a stigmatized group, then that person would try to justify the reason why they debated in favor of them in their daily life as well. So leveraging this theory, we wanted to see if we can make our treatment group argue in favor of a stigmatized group and thereby reduce the stigma that they held by comparing it pre-treatment and post-treatment. So this is one of the experiments that we're currently working on. There's a few research questions within this, like the difference between factual arguments and moral arguments, because factual arguments are the ones which deal more with evidence and statistics, and while moral are the ones which would influence more broader abstract beliefs of, say, justice or morality. So one of our research questions was, how does the nature of the argument made by the subject change the way in which dissonance is created and change their attitudes? So given a lack of time, I won't go into the various sub-research questions we had. From an umbrella perspective, it was control versus treatment, whether our subjects arguing have less stigma by the end of the experiment as the ones in the control group. Factual versus moral, we hypothesized that those making factual arguments in favor of the stigmatized group would have lesser stigmatizing perceptions than the ones who made factual arguments. Finally, high payout versus low payout. Paying our subjects is something that sort of crowds out their motivation to reduce cognitive dissonance. So if I give you 20 rupees versus I give somebody else 2,000 rupees for doing the same action, the way in which their respective cognitive dissonance goes down is actually different. So you would expect that the 2,000 rupee person, they will be more likely to, argue better and have their stigma go down more. But that's actually not the case. The people given the small payout don't have that justification that the people with the high payout have for engaging in the debate that they did. So the 20 rupee people will actually find more intrinsic justification, which is changing their attitudes in order to justify the argument that they made in favor of the stigmatized group. So this is something that we are currently trying to evaluate on field. We have this representative sample in Gujarat of 1,800 people. We have these 6 treatment arms, 2 control, 4 treatment, which explore all our research questions. And I won't go into the implementation of it, but essentially it's a baseline, it's an intervention, and then there's an end line to see baseline versus end line changes in their threat perception of the stigmatized group, their outgroup attitudes towards a specific stigmatized group, etc. This is particularly relevant in the pandemic setting because if you remember, during the early months of the pandemic, certain ethnic and certain religious groups were linked very baselessly with spreading the virus. For example, there was the Tablighi Jamaat incident in Delhi, which was carried forth for a very long time, even though there were simultaneous incidents and simultaneous groups facing the same situation happening elsewhere, except the stigma faced by that particular group was greater because the sort of perceived threat from that group was greater. So in that context, we wanted to test this cognitive dissonance theory out and see if by making the people debate in favor of the stigmatized group, we can reduce their threat perception of that group. All right. So in conclusion, we also wanted to share some of our personal experiences of entering the behavior science field and what it feels like as recent graduates to work in this field and what motivated us. So I'll go ahead and start with mine, and then Tirtha, please feel free to add. So essentially, I graduated very recently, and I entered college with the intention that I will study. Well, I didn't know what to study. I was in a liberal arts college. So in my second year, I chose to do public policy. And over the second and third year, I sort of delved into experimental social sciences. So there was this lab in FLAME, which is the Center for Experimental Social Sciences. It was set up by Oxford University and FLAME jointly. And they conducted social science experiments there. So they were conducting experiments in political science, sociology, trust, behavior economics, etc., all sorts of social science fields. And that's sort of where I developed a surface level interest of experimental methods. And from that point on, I sort of talked more to pre-docs who were dealing in behavior science and reading up on literature in this field. and finally decided to explore what it feels like to work in this field when I realized that a CSBC was being set up in Ashoka, and a lot of my old the people I worked with in CES were actually going towards CSBC to work in the behavior science field. So that's how I ended up in CSBC. And one point that I like to add for all of those who are still confused about whether they're interested in this field, how do they decide whether they're interested in this field? Everybody in this field will agree that it's very hard to sort of tell whether you're interested in this field. Proxy experiences are very important. So my suggestion would be to intern or to work with a consulting, a behavior science organization, or an experimental lab even, to sort of get a proxy experience of how academia is applied and the research that academia does is applied in the field. Yeah, I'll pause there. Tirtha, over to you.
Yes. Thanks, Ayush. So actually, my experience getting into this field is also very similar. I went to FLAME as a liberal arts student, given that even when I graduated from school, I had no idea what I wanted to do next. Everything academic seemed interesting to me at that point. And then FLAME gave me the opportunity at that point for 2 years to just explore different courses from all different fields, from physical and natural sciences to humanities to fine and performing arts. And even after spending 2 years doing multiple courses, I couldn't make a decision, right? Like, what I believe in is you try multiple things and then you decide what you don't like. That is, use the process of elimination to identify things you don't like to finally arrive at something that you truly enjoy. And this is primarily for people who enjoy a lot of things. That way I ended up doing a double major in applied mathematics and environmental studies. So both of these were deeply rooted in physical and natural sciences. And as a result, majority of my coursework was in primarily mathematics. It's either pure math or it would be programming, modeling, and so on, right? So it's applied math. While I was doing this, at the same time, I was introduced to the center that started in FLAME, which is the Center for Experimental Social Sciences that Ayush talked about. And I started interning there to get exposed to the economics and public policy side of things, given that I had done courses in my first 2 years for these. And as a result, what I found most interesting is the use of experimental method, right? Like, it was perfectly up my alley at that point because my quantitative reasoning and the work that I did in mathematics could be applied here. And I could see some real world changes instantly rather than, let's say, 100 years after I die. And as a result, I then ended up joining FLAME CES as a research associate after I graduated. And I continued doing experimental research. This is where I was introduced to a lot of behavioral concepts, right? Because we had to deal with such nuanced questions like, how do you measure trust, right, in economics game? Or how do you measure somebody's risk perception, etc. And that is what interested me the most, right? The measurement aspect of behavioral science and finding different ways and teasing out different methods and devising and developing games wherein you can get people to play, and then based on how they behave in the games, you can identify and measure and quantify behaviors like trust and risk perception and so on. And as a result, I became very interested, found out about CSBC, and joined here at Ashoka, doing core behavior science work, but with a more action focused rather than purely research focused. So the difference between the two is, over there I was doing more measurement development, whereas over here I do more intervention evaluation. And I guess that's primarily the shift that I experienced of how behavior science can be applied in real life.
Thank you so much. I think this is like a good segue to get into questions. So, Drisha.
Yeah. Does anyone have questions? We can recognize you in the chat box and you can unmute yourself. Anika?
Yes, hi. First of all, thank you for this talk. It was very informative. I just wanted to know, for someone who is majoring in psychology right now and sort of wants to get into behavioral insights, is there any linear academic, maybe like for instance, for masters courses that we should look at, or skill sets that we should look at developing to get into behavioral sciences?
Ayush, do you want to take that?
I'm not sure I'm in the best place to respond because you're applying for masters. So I think it'll be best if, you could elaborate.
Sure. Okay. So what I would say is entering into, again, behavior science master's education directly would have multiple ways to go about it, right? Like you could either apply for a policy program if you want to do policy work eventually, and then have a concentration wherein your methodology that you use is behavioral, right? So that's where you're marrying your psychology with impact oriented work. Or you could actually directly apply for a master's in psych program or a master's in behavioral economics program, right? So I think it depends also on the kind of work you want to do after you graduate from your master's. It's either you could do academic work, in which case what your skill development would require is your research method skills, your quant skills, your qualitative field work skills, etc. Would need to be extremely high, right? And that is what master's programs will look at, versus if you want to go into more applied focus programs where you are applying this knowledge in real world, then in that case, these are the skills that you will develop as part of the program. So what they look for in that case is your interest in public leadership and service. Right, so I think that it will depend more, and you'll be able to figure out better of what or which path you want to take. Is it the applied path? Is it academia? Once you perhaps start working after your undergrad, work for a year or two, figure out, try both to see which one you enjoy more.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, while they come up with questions, I sort of had a question for you, Tirtha. I was sort of wondering, how long do you take to evaluate an intervention, especially when the intervention in some sense has to be changed over time, right? Like one intervention doesn't guarantee long-term results. So especially in the case that you described where there was a fear-based route, fear sometimes, especially when it comes to the pandemic, gets normalized. So how then does how long does it take for you to introduce a different intervention to adhere to that same behavior and that targeted goal that you're looking for?
Right. So actually, that's a very interesting question. So I would, if I had a longer session, I would have talked about how the work that we did for the Bihar PCI bit on COVID communication was actually a very rapid response work, right? Like today, I need to test something for them to implement it tomorrow, because that situation required that amount of urgency. And as a result, the intervention that you test cannot be longer than a day. So if you see the gap between the treatment and the survey, the end-line survey that we conducted was only 24 hours, right? Usually if you see RCTs, they go on for years. And that is where you have this rapid feedback mechanism wherein you are updating the intervention as and when it's actually being implemented, to see how and when it's responding to its immediate environment and what are the improvements that need to be made. But with urgent rapid evaluations, that is not possible. So you have a fixed collateral, you test that, and you immediately decide whether you want to actually deploy it or disseminate it at a wider scale or not, right? But the issue over here and the challenge that you face is with an RCT, you can come up. It's more about perfecting an intervention, whereas with something like a rapid evaluation is more for decision making, right? So the gap between the treatment and your outcome measurement is very small. And what ends up happening is I don't, in that case, know whether the effect of the intervention is going to die out in a day, right? Because I measured it only after a day. What if the fear that it generated was temporary?
I feel like the question dragged off a bit, or the response.
I feel like Tirtha got cut off.
Yeah.
Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we
I can
can.
hear you now.
Perfect. What was the last thing that you guys heard?
I think you said something along the lines of you need to sort of create a condition where fear can be faced again.
Right. Yes. So it's basically, I think it's more about the drawback of you not knowing whether the effect of the intervention stays on for long enough or not, right? But the distinction that you would want to make here is that you do different kinds of evaluation, even though the methodology is the same. You do different kinds of evaluation for different purposes. One is to perfect an intervention, and the other is more to make decisions instantly.
Right.
I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
While we are looking for, and guys, please feel free to ask questions. A couple of questions that came up during the session. One was a clarificatory question, and either of you guys could take it, was about the speed bump and how you executed that. And the second is, it's a bit of a two-part question, which is that how do you deal, because the problem that traditional economics and even psychology faced was homogeneity. And because and India is a good example in that regard because of the heterogeneous groups that we have. Like we were mentioning that a lot of Western models assume a lot of things in their experiments. So how do you deal with that? And the second is a little more topical in the question it's asked, which is that how do you deal with like how does behavioral policies which are based on behavioral interventions and principles interact with traditional financial planning, for example. So the specific idea they had in mind was about if countries implement 5-year plans, how do you deal with that when interventions, as Tirtha, you just said recently, have to be done much faster than that? So what's the reaction mix, that kind?
Yes, so I'll start with the first question on the speed bumping bit, and then I can let Ayush answer the rest of the two. The speed bumping intervention that we had developed was, we developed an audio message which was consistent with the other treatments, in a way that the only addition that we made was we had a short breathing exercise at the beginning of counting from 1 to 10, right? As it's like, we know you're extremely stressed because of COVID, that you're not able to step out. Let's take a long, deep breath for 5 seconds, count from 1 to 10, and then you provide the actual message of there are the only 4 things that you need to remember, right? Not the 100 things that you hear from people. It's as simple as do not step out if not necessary, wear a mask when you step out, maintain social distance, and call the frontline health worker, nearest frontline health worker when needed to report any symptoms, right? So it's that deep breathing exercise that gives you that 10-minute bump, like a speed breaker, for you to enter into your systems too when the actual message is being delivered. Ayush, do you want to take the other 2 questions?
Sure. I can take up the one which asked about how, if we have a 5-year plan system, how do we figure in behavioral policy, behavior insights informed policy making over there? So I just like to take the example of Kerala, the only state which still does 5-year plans in India. They have the 13th one going on right now. Alex Sutherland from the Behavioral Insights team UK, the original BIT, he once said that you have to be, as a Behavioral Insights team, proactive in the kind of suggestions you're making for policy. So there's quite a disconnect right now between what finance ministers and politicians think is required for people versus what behavioral insights teams know can be made better in the way that it's being delivered to people. So I think the gap over there and the need for budgetary allocation towards behavioral insights team, first it can be solved by having wings within the behavioral insights team that sort of are specific to the various ministries, because every single ministry in a government can benefit from a team like that. Secondly, it's very important for that team to be very proactive in the kind of suggestions they offer, because politicians and people in general in politics, any sort of bureaucrats, they don't approach teams like us for a presence felt and have to sort of push forth the recommendations in a way that they seem required, and that proactivity is what is required from a team in order to have our insights applied on field. And apart from that, I'm sorry, I don't recall the third question that was there.
No, I feel like that answers both the questions, which was that about the interaction between how behavioral policy and financial and political advice works. The initial question was just about diversity, like how do you deal with that? How do you deal with because there's much more easier to conduct homogeneous experiments, but I feel that that's the second part of the question.
Sure. Tirtha, you have much more experience in this than me. I'll let you answer that one.
Definitely. So I think when you're evaluating a specific intervention, the intervention that behavioral economics develops is based on human behavior, right? It's not based on your cultural behavior. So what I am trying to do is increase your risk perception, even though my intervention can increase one culture's risk perception higher than the other based on which social norm it's targeting. But it could also be very intrinsic, wherein, for example, generating fear about anything happening to your family will work across cultures, right? So in developing these interventions, because they are based on human behavior specifically and not cultural differences, it becomes very easy. However, during evaluation, the one thing that you need to make sure is that all the subjects that you are actually conducting the research on, all the participants of your study would have to be equally randomized between control and treatment. So if there are 5 people from one culture in the control, there have to be 5 people in treatment as well, right? So it's that random assignment, random but stratified assignment between control and treatment is a way that you can actually evaluate the intervention, because you know that similar people that were in control got the treatment, and then you can actually compare those 2 results, while knowing that it wasn't other factors that affected the change in behavior, but rather the intervention alone.
Thank you. I think Ria had a question. Ria?
Yeah, hi. So I think this is a question I've asked a few of the seniors here already when I joined ABIT, but I wanted to ask you guys too, because you all have been in the field for quite some time. My question was around how you account for biases while conducting research or when you're in the field. I think, and you have answered a part of it in the previous questions, but especially your own biases by looking for information, and how do you account for the participants' biases at the same time, because that is likely to skew your results to quite an extent.
Definitely.
Yeah, I just have 2 points to say. Sure, and please feel free to add. So the first point about our biases while doing research, very good point, and it's a point that plagues academia. Like, how do you actually believe in the credibility of a researcher, because they're humans as well and they have biases. That one way that academia as a whole is trying to solve this, especially experimental social sciences, is this business of pre-analysis plans. So now you register your initial hypotheses online in trees for PAPs, and this is done before you actually collect your data or you sort of implement your treatments on field. The reason they do this is because if we've already registered, it's harder for us to judge hypotheses to more support the sort of conclusions we see once we get the data back. And this happens a lot, that after we get the data back, we'll, to make our research more attractive, we'll sort of change our initial hypotheses to be more in favor of the results that we received. So that's one way to solve for our biases that I can think of. The other one for accounting for subjects biases is, in our feedback questionnaire, we have questions that can sort of control for that. So for example, if we want to control for social desirability, especially if our subjects are giving somebody answers who is sort of in a hierarchically senior position to them. For example, if we do our data collection through a frontline health worker, the subject is likely to be slightly socially desirable in their responses, because they want to appease the person they're giving the responses to. So we can control for this by asking asking something called the social desirability score. So these are 5 questions we've included in one of our current project questionnaires, where based on the responses that we receive, we create a social desirability score, which we can then control for by we can control while testing the correlations between the other variables and the data that we receive.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, pause there.
One follow-up question, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was wondering, when you mentioned that, for example, you have a feedback form or you talk to people to gain data, and here I'm mainly talking about qualitative data. So when you do that, what mode do you prefer to get your data? Because, for example, if you just give out a survey is likely to give you probably the frequency of a behavior more than say answering the why of that behavior. So how do you go about that? Do you do, say, a survey plus in-depth interviews, or do you largely fall back upon surveys for your data?
I can take that question up. So I think we do both kinds of data collection, and both kinds of data collection give you different answers, right? So one is, as you mentioned, qualitative work, which will give you insights into what are the different, I wouldn't say particularly causes, but what are the different barriers or facilitators of a particular behavior, right? Like, why is it that a person, when the behavior is what is good for them, why is it that they still wouldn't do it? Or for the people who actually do it, who are called positive deviants, why is it that they do that behavior, right? What is that reason behind it? And as part of that qualitative work, the way we maintain the researcher's bias is we have a third person in place along with the person who is conducting the interview, right? So we can do it multiple ways. We conduct in-depth interviews, we conduct focus group discussions, and so on. And especially during COVID, given that we can't actually go on field, we get the participant to get on a Zoom call, and there are 3 people on a Zoom call. One person is the person who is actually interacting with the participant, and then you have a third person who is making an observation, who is making notes while these interactions go on based on the interaction, right? So you have two people's perspective, and this is likely to reduce bias. The other kind of data collection we do is experimental. That is, after you have different ideas, you are testing them, right? You are checking which one is more effective. You are comparing two things, or you are comparing that one thing with status quo, right? And in that case, the way a researcher's bias is reduced is the way Ayush mentioned. You draft PAPs, you submit pre-analysis plans, which binds you to not change your hypotheses at a later date when data comes in, because it causes cognitive dissonance for you, right? So that is the way you control the researcher's bias. And the subject's bias is one way through the feedback surveys or the feedback games that you play with them. But at the same time, the beauty of randomization itself controls for a lot of biases, right? So given that you're randomly assigning people to control and treatment, you can fairly assume that the number of people who have bias in the control would also have bias in the treatment, right? And that way it cancels itself out. So when you're comparing responses of a treatment to the control, you are simply canceling out the number of people who had biases in both because they're equal. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That also answers the last question we had, which was about the mix of qualitative and quantitative research techniques that are used in behavioral sciences. I feel thank you to everyone for attending, but also thank you, extremely thank you to both Ayush and Tirtha for conducting this event. It was extremely helpful for us, because I feel like we've also got a firm grounding in where to look at when we're talking beyond behavioral science, which is really useful. For everyone who's present right now, please do look up the Center for Social and Behavioral Change. They've given the website and the details out. You can check their research, their experiments, and also, a shout out to what inspired this webinar series, Behaviorally Speaking, which is also quite a useful and entertaining webinar series, which everyone who's interested can and should attend. We really like to once again really just thank Tirtha and Ayush for conducting this webinar, and also please stick around. We will be having more of these webinars. If you have any doubts or clarifications, you can send them to ABIT. I'll ask Ayush and Tirtha right now if they're comfortable with receiving mails, but
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Udhayan. Feel free to shoot me a mail about any queries.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's recorded, and we will also be sending a written document of sorts detailing like the questions asked for future interest. Thank you so much for attending, and have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Tirtha and Ayush, please stay back.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.